Welcome to the Den of Dissent. This is a show where we challenge the current culture and mainstream talking points of the day. What is the news telling us? What is the culture telling us? Where is our civilization headed? And by what standard do we judge these issues? Do you agree or do you dissent? Let's find out. All right, check it out. Back with part 2. So let's just jump right into it. Now, we're continuing on from this article. America did not invent slavery. It ended slavery. That's the title of the article in the New American, written by Steve Bias. So let's continue further where we left off at. America's many abolitionists. So let's talk about the people that were trying to abolish slavery. Okay. John Randolph, a cousin of Jefferson and a descendant of John Rolfe, and his Indian wife, Pocahontas, became an ardent opponent of slavery. He described the horror of a slave auction in which a slave woman was going to have her children taken from her. Quote, "The greatest orator I ever heard was a woman. She was a slave, she was a mother, and her rostrum was the auction block." End of quote. Randolph inherited a plantation with slaves and worked many years to free the estate from debt so he could emancipate his own slaves. Not only did he free them, he purchased land for them in the free state of Ohio. So earlier, the article was talking about this professor who was saying that he wishes America had a William Wilberforce. So this article is pointing out that America had a few William Wilberforces, people that wanted to abolish slavery, white people too. I just got to point that out, and blacks, obviously. Goes on to say, sainted souls here and there. While much attention has been rightly paid to the work of British abolitionist William Wilberforce, abolitionism was even more prominent in the United States. One striking example of extensive abolitionist efforts was the Underground Railroad, which used safe houses to help thousands escape from slavery. William Lloyd Garrison, a strong abolitionist, had a rope tied around him and was dragged through the streets of Boston. An Illinois mob murdered abolitionist Elijah Lovejoy, the editor of a newspaper in Alton, Illinois, and both he and his printing press were thrown into the Mississippi River. John Greenleaf Whittier, a Quaker from New England, lost his publishing opportunities for his literary works because of his public opposition to slavery. In Connecticut, a woman was jailed for teaching blacks to read. Despite such intense opposition, abolitionists persevered. Following the Mexican War, the discovery of gold in California caused such a tremendous increase in that area's population that it quickly needed to become a state. The problem was that California wanted to enter the Union as a free state where slavery would be illegal, and this would give the free states a one-state majority over the slave states. This led to the Compromise of 1850, which stated that that California would enter the Union as a free state, but also provided a draconian fugitive slave statute under which a person could be jailed for helping a slave to escape. So let's go back a little bit. You see all these people that actually suffered for the cause of trying to abolish slavery. Okay, so you had white men like William Lloyd Garrison, who was an abolitionist. He had a rope tied around him and dragged through the streets of Boston because of his stance on the evils of slavery. Okay, so he went to that extent. He was persecuted for that. You can look that up. William Lloyd Garrison, Elijah Lovejoy, John Greenleaf lost his publishing opportunities for his literary works because of his opposition to slavery. And it talks about this woman who was jailed for teaching blacks to read. So again, I just want to stress this because as much as, people like to blame whites for slavery, people also leave out the fact that whites were also involved in abolishing slavery. Were whites involved in slavery? Yes. Were blacks involved in slavery? Yes. Were whites involved in abolishing slavery? Yes. Were blacks involved as well? Yes. So there's good, there's evil on both sides. Just trying to point that out because that's left out a lot. Let's go on. It talks about the fugitive slave law. The fugitive slave law was extremely unpopular in many states that had already abolished slavery, and many resorted to nullification to frustrate its enforcement. Nullification is a doctrine first advocated by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in opposition to an attempt by Congress to suppress freedom of speech and freedom of the press in 1798. According to their nullification doctrine, states should interpose themselves between their citizens and the federal government if the federal government tries to enforce an unconstitutional law in their state. Wisconsin's Supreme Court declared the fugitive slave law unconstitutional, and its legislature even claimed the right to secede from the United States if the national government persisted in forcing obedience to the law. Vermont passed a law forbidding the return of fugitive slaves. Other states fined law officers who assisted in the capture of an alleged runaway slave and revoked the law licenses of lawyers who represented the owner of a fugitive slave. Massachusetts even enacted legislation that said a law officer could be imprisoned for 5 years if he helped enforce the fugitive slave law. So here you have these states just battling, actually throughout the country. They're battling over slavery because there's people that just, they don't want slavery. They want to abolish it. And so you can see that the worldview and people's outlook on slavery is changing. It's not uniform throughout the whole country. And even Vermont passed a law forbidding the return of fugitive slaves. So you're a slave, you escape, you get to Vermont. Vermont passed a law forbidding the return. So if a state wanted that slave back, Vermont had a law that forbid that slave would return back to that slave state and be back in slavery again. So it's not like, again, you just hear that America as a whole was just engaged in slavery and America just wanted, slavery all around. But that's not true. There was states battling and going to war for this idea, for going to war for freedom, really. Now let's go on. The Underground Railroad. It says many people, both black and white, actively helped slaves escape, even though it could have put them in legal jeopardy. The Underground Railroad was one such example. Neither underground nor railroad, it was rather a system of well-planned routes of escape for slaves. Houses, barns, and other dwellings about 20 miles apart where the fugitive slaves could be concealed during the day were called the stations of the road. When night fell, the runaways would then be taken to their next station. Some went all the way into Canada on this railroad. Levi Coffin, a Quaker who was dubbed the president of the Underground Railroad because he aided in the escape of more than 3,000 slaves. Many famous conductors, such as Harriet Tubman, a former slave herself, assisted slaves on the railroad. Frederick Douglass was among the more famous black abolitionists. Born a slave in Maryland, Douglass managed to escape to the North, where he took up the abolitionist cause as a gifted orator, a writer, and editor. After the Civil War, he was appointed U.S. ambassador to Haiti. After she heard Douglass speak in Bristol, England in 1846, Mary Estlin praised him in a letter to an American abolitionist. There is but one opinion of him. Wherever he goes, he arouses sympathy in your cause. Our expectations were highly roused by his narrative, his printed speeches, and the eulogisms of the friends with whom he has been staying. But he far exceeds the picture we had formed both in our outward graces, intellectual power and culture and eloquence. If his words then are any guide to what he would say now, we can safely assume that Douglass would disagree with those who argue that America was founded upon slavery. On the contrary, Douglas revered the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, calling them liberty documents. Stop there real quick. So Douglas, Frederick Douglass, he was an abolitionist and he was an intelligent man. And so you see with Douglas, he got appointed to be an ambassador to Haiti, a U.S. ambassador, right? So think about that. Even back then in the 1800s, a black man is appointed to be an ambassador for the United States, a powerful position. Okay. So again, when we hear these talks of, blacks being destitute and just having absolutely no opportunity, even back then, a man like Frederick Douglass could rise up and become an ambassador to Haiti from the United States, right? Think about that. The so-called country that invented slavery, or the country where slavery is so rampant as we're taught today. Frederick Douglass, a black man, can become an ambassador, a U.S. ambassador to Haiti in this so-called white supremacist nation. Think about that. So I'm just pointing these things out because I really want to touch on some of these false talking points, as if like everything, there is just absolutely no opportunity for anybody, especially for blacks. Let's go on. It says, rather than accept the vile accusations of the 1619 Project and other radical criticisms saying that the founding of America was centered around slavery and that slavery was America's original sin and our peculiar institution, Americans need to stand up to those who would distort our nation's founding. America did not originate slavery, but was actually a leader in its ultimate demise. So again, there you go. Just pointing out some of these interesting historical facts. And I just want to bring up a couple more facts. So earlier we were talking about, I talked about King Gizo, right? And King Gizo, I never heard about King Gizo until I read this article. Well, which was a while back. But anyway, King Gizo, just going back to him from, I think it was West Africa. This is from the BBC, British broadcasting news website in the UK. So it says, it talks about African slave owners. Let me see if I could blow this up real quick. It talks about African slave owners, right? And it says many societies in Africa with kings and hierarchical forms of government traditionally kept slaves, but these were mostly used for domestic purposes. They were an indication of power and wealth and not used for commercial gain. However, with the appearance of Europeans desperate to buy slaves for use in the Americas, the character of African slave ownership changed. Goes on to say, growing rich with slavery royalty in the early 18th century, kings of Dahomey, known today as Benin, became big players in the slave trade, waging a bitter war on their neighbors, resulting in the capture of 10,000, including another important slave trader, the king of Whydah. King Tegbesu, King Tegbesu made 250,000, I think that's euros or British currency, a year selling people into slavery in 1750. King Gizo said in the 1840s he would do anything the British wanted him to do apart from giving up the slave trade. Quote, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." So here it's talking about slavery just being a way to wealth, to gain wealth and gaining royalty. And these were African slave owners, African slave traders. And it talks about how the Europeans wanted to buy slaves. So the slaves like King Gizo, the kings like King Gizo, King Tegbesu saw their people as slaves, and Europeans wanted to buy those slaves. So they said, hey, the Europeans are giving us a good price for these slaves. Yeah, these are our people, but you know what? We're getting a good price for our people. So I think we might have to make some trades and grow our wealth. Okay. So what does that tell you? Slavery is it's a universal thing that almost all people have engaged in. And it really just goes back to the heart of man. I want to touch on this article real quick. Earlier, I had talked about about John Kaser. He's the first black man to be declared slave for life in America. And remember, I was talking about his slave owner who was from Angola, another black man who owned him. And this is from the Smithsonian Magazine. And it talks about, it says, the only date definitely connected to John Kaser's life in this day in 1654 or 1655, it's not when he was born, when he achieved something, or when he died. It's when he became a slave. Kaser was originally an indentured servant, which meant he was practically a slave in some senses. But what was bought or sold wasn't him. It was his contract of indenture, which obligated him to work for its holder for the period it set. At the end of that time, indentured servants who could be of any race were considered legally free and sent out into the world. So you had black indentured servants, you had white indentured servants. So where was the white privilege as far as the indentured servanthood? Okay. You're not going to hear about that, right? You just hear that, white people just had it all good and it was, sunshine and flowers, right? But yes, there was white indentured servants as well. This might sound like a rough deal, but indenture was how the British colonizers who lived in what would later become the United States managed to populate the land and get enough people to do the back-breaking work of farming crops like tobacco in the South. People who survived their period of indenture went on to live free lives in the colonies. Now, it also goes on to say, but Africans who were indentured were often captured and brought over against their will. That's what happened to the holder of Kaser's indenture, Anthony Johnson. Remember, I talked about Anthony Johnson, the guy from Angola, black guy. Okay. Johnson, he served out his contract and went on to run his own tobacco farm, hold his own indentured servants, among them Kaser. So remember, when I talked about that earlier, Anthony Johnson was an indentured servant. He got released from his contract, got some land, got some slaves, black slaves, a black slave master owning some black slaves, right? He got this indentured servant. Kaser, from what I read earlier, tried to escape. He escaped. Then he met a white man, a white guy who wanted to take him in, but his slave master, Anthony Johnson, right? The black dude was like, no, I want my slave back. So he got his slave back. They went to the courts. He got his slave back from the white dude. So the white guy couldn't keep him. So Anthony Kaser went back to his slave master. So you would think, right, with all, you would think that Anthony Johnson would say, hey, man, man, I had to endure slavery and I just came from Angola and I went through all these hardships, and you're my fellow brother. So, man, you know what? You got your freedom. Go ahead and keep your freedom. No, he was like, no, you coming back. That's what he did. So just think about that. And I'm sure you haven't heard that. It says, after a disagreement about whether or not Kaser's contract was lapsed, the court ruled in favor of Johnson. And Kaser saw that the status of his indenture turned into slavery, where he, not his contract, was considered property. Kaser claimed that he had served his indenture of 7 or 8 years. And it says the court sided with Johnson, who claimed that Kaser was his slave for life. So you got a black man enslaving another black man for life. He fought. This black man fought to keep his fellow brother enslaved. You're not going to hear about this on MSNBC. I guarantee you. Anyway, let's go on. I wanted to read some of Thomas Sowell's book. So Thomas Sowell, Black economist, he wrote a book called Black Rednecks and White Liberals, right? And he has a chapter on slavery, very informative. So I just want to read a little bit from that chapter and touch on a few other points about what he says in this book. So let's check it out real quick. So he has a chapter called The Real History of Slavery. I'm trying to blow it up a little bit. Let me see. Okay. So he starts off in this chapter. He says, slavery was an evil of greater scope and magnitude than most people imagine. And as a result, its place in history is radically different from the way it is usually portrayed. Mention slavery, and immediately the image that arises is that of Africans and their descendants enslaved by Europeans and their descendants in the southern United States. Or, at most, Africans enslaved by Europeans in the Western Hemisphere. No other historic horror is so narrowly construed. No one thinks of war, famine, or decimating epidemics in such localized terms. These are afflictions that have been suffered by the entire human race all over the planet. And so was slavery. Had slavery been limited to one race in one country during 3 centuries, its tragedies would not have been 1/10 the magnitude that they were in fact. So you see, what he's saying is that when it comes to slavery, it's just viewed in a very narrow way. And it's just viewed through a particular lens, which is the lens of blacks being oppressed by whites. And he's taken slavery and comparing it to war, famine, and epidemics. And he's saying that you don't view war as something that's attributed to one specific race or belongs to one specific race, right? Or ethnicity. Like, it's not like only the Jews went through war, or the Jews went through persecution, or the Iraqis only dealt with war. No, war has plagued every people, every group of people. And he says the same thing about famine. Everybody has experienced slavery, and everybody almost has engaged in slavery. He says these are afflictions that have been suffered by the entire human race. And I like the point that he made. He said, when you mention slavery, the image that arises is that of Africans and their descendants enslaved by Europeans. That's all you ever hear about. You don't hear about slavery being engaged in by other cultures, by Arabs, right? By Romans, etc. Now he goes on, he says, why this provincial view of a worldwide evil? Often it is those who are the most critical of a Eurocentric view of the world who are most Eurocentric when it comes to the evils and failings of the human race. Why would anyone wish to arbitrarily understate an evil that plagued mankind for thousands of years unless it was not this evil itself that was the real concern, but rather the present day uses of that historic evil? Clearly, the ability to score ideological points against American society or Western civilization, or to induce guilt and thereby extract benefits from the white population today, are greatly enhanced by making enslavement appear to be a peculiarly American or peculiarly white crime. You see? So this is what Thomas Sowell is saying. Thomas Sowell, well-known black economist, well-researched. He's saying that when you think of slavery, it's almost like it's exclusively a white crime, which is so untrue when you really dig into history. I'm going to go on a little bit and try to wrap up soon. So he goes on to say that he says it takes no more research than a trip to almost any public library or college library to show the incredibly lopsided coverage of slavery in the United States or in the Western Hemisphere as compared to the meager writings on the even larger number of Africans enslaved in the Islamic countries of the Middle East and North Africa, not to mention the vast numbers of Europeans also enslaved in centuries past in the Islamic world and within Europe itself. Let me pause right there. He's saying again, the view of slavery is so lopsided, right? Especially when you hear mainstream media and academia, the institutions, right? He's saying that there's an even larger number of Africans enslaved in the Islamic countries of the Middle East. What do you mostly hear about? You mostly hear about whites and Europeans enslaving blacks. How often do you hear about the larger number that he says of blacks being enslaved by the Islamic countries of the Middle East and North Africa? How often do you hear about the Europeans that were also enslaved in centuries past? Europeans, yes, white people that were enslaved in centuries past in the Islamic world as well. How often do you hear about that? No, it's just almost always an exclusively black thing, right? Or whites being the exclusive slave masters and nobody else, right? You don't hear about the Arabs. Anyway, what else does he say? He says, at least 1 million Europeans were enslaved by North African pirates alone from 1500 to 1800. And some European slaves were still being sold on the auction block in Egypt. Years after the Emancipation Proclamation freed blacks in the United States. Indeed, an Anglo-Egyptian treaty on August 4th, 1877, prohibited the continued sale of white slaves after August 3rd, 1885, as well as prohibiting the import and export of Sudanese and Abyssinian slaves. Hold on. Did y'all just hear that? Hold on, man. Seriously. He said, he said European slaves were still being sold on the auction block in Egypt. European slaves, think about that. White people were being sold on the auction block in Africa. Where's Egypt? Africa. Okay. Years. He said years after the Emancipation Proclamation freed blacks. So blacks were freed in America before the Europeans were enslaved in Africa. Blacks were freed in America before whites were freed in Africa. Europeans were enslaved in Africa while blacks in America were free. In other words, sorry if I twisted that all up. Yes, that sounds crazy. How often have you heard that? Do you hear that at all? Right? That's a shocker. Okay, he says, during the Middle Ages, Slavs were so widely used as slaves in both Europe and the Islamic world that the very word slave derived from the word Slav, not only in English, but also in other European languages, as well as in Arabic. Nor have Asians or Polynesians been exempt from either being enslaved or enslaving others. China in centuries past has been described as one of the largest and most comprehensive markets for the exchange of human beings in the world. Slavery was so common in India, where it has been estimated that there were more slaves than in the entire Western Hemisphere, and where the original thugs kidnapped children for the purpose of enslavement. In some of the cities of Southeast Asia, slaves were a majority of the population. Slavery was also an established institution in the Western Hemisphere before Columbus's ships ever appeared on the horizon. The Ottoman Empire regularly enslaved a percentage of the young boys from the Balkans, converted them to Islam and assigned them to various duties in the civil or military establishment. Let me go on a little bit more. The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East for at least 6 centuries before, keyword before, the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. So I thought that was interesting too. He says the instrumental use of history of slavery, it underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. So it didn't grow out of racism. It's just, it's an evil that is practiced amongst all cultures. And people were vulnerable at the time. It was like an exercise of power and wealth and dominance. It really didn't have, it really didn't grow out of racism. He says for most of its long history, which includes the history of the human race, it was largely not the enslavement of racially different people. Because only in recent centuries has either the technology or wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves. So basically, a lot of slavery was pretty much local. It was practiced in a certain region. Some people didn't have the resources to go across seas to go capture slaves. So it was pretty much done to their own people. People in a certain region practiced slavery against their own people. It's not like the Europeans were like, man, I hate black people so much that I want to go to Africa and enslave them and capture them. No, the Europeans, they had people before they had the technology to go to other countries. They practiced it on their own people. Once they had technology and the ships and transportation, then they said, okay, let's expand this trade. And that's what they did. He also goes on to say, before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans. Asians enslaved other Asians. Africans enslaved other Africans. And the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. So basically, he just said what I was saying. I'll finish with this. He says, wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. The Europeans who were enslaved in North Africa were despised and abused because they were Christians in a Muslim region of the world, where they were called Christian dogs. Did you hear that? There was Christians that were enslaved and they were called Christian dogs by the Muslim slave owners in the Muslim regions. Race became the most visible difference between slaves and slave owners in the Western Hemisphere. As distinguished historian Daniel J. Boorstin put it, now for the first time in Western history, the status of slave coincided with a difference of race. So before slavery, it had nothing to do with race. Okay, it was just you had a different people that were enslaved in different regions, like the Europeans, the Christians that were enslaved in the Muslim region. And race, he said, race became the most visible difference between slaves and slave owners in the Western Hemisphere. And that was the first time in Western history that happened. So now there was becoming a different way to do slavery, I guess. But anyway, I just wanted to touch on some of the things that Thomas Sowell mentioned in that article. So he talked about the word slave, where it came from. So again, I'm going to point out the BBC that wrote this article. The roots of slavery. The term slave has its origin in the word Slav, The Slavs who inhabited a large part of Eastern Europe were taken as slaves by the Muslims of Spain during the 9th century AD. So again, the word slave comes from the word Slav. The Slavs were European. They weren't black. So the word slavery, slave, didn't even originate in Africa. It came from the Europeans because the Europeans were practicing slavery on other Europeans. It says slavery can broadly be described as the ownership, blah, blah, blah. You already get that. Another thing I thought that was interesting was when he Thomas Sowell, he talked about the thugs in India, right? He said slavery was also common in India. And he said the original thugs kidnapped children for the purpose of enslavement. I forgot about this fact, but thug, the word thug, thuggy, was a historical. They were historical organized gangs of professional robbers and murderers in India. They were said to have traveled in groups across the Indian subcontinent. They usually murdered their victims by strangling, using a handkerchief as a tool. The thuggy were believed to practice their killings as a form of worship toward the goddess Kali. So these were the Indian thugs. So when you hear the word thug today, where does that come from? It comes from the Indians, the thuggies. The thuggy, it was a group. So you think about hip hop culture, right? A lot of thuggery going on. That term is used widely, very popular term in hip hop, thug. But even hip hop didn't invent that. That's not even from black culture. That came from Indians, the Indian culture. What else? Another interesting fact that he brought up was when he talked about the Christians and the Europeans being enslaved by Muslims and by Arabs. I thought that was interesting, so I wanted to look up a source on that. And there's a book called "The Slave Trade of Eastern Africa" by R.W. Beachy, and there was a gentleman that did a review on it. So I just want to read like a small portion of that. So the slave trade of Eastern Africa, it was reviewed by David Breon Davis, Farnham Professor of History, Yale University. So he says it now seems probable that Muslim traders transported more African slaves to Asia than were shipped to the New World by Christians during the entire history of the Atlantic slave trade. He says it's probable that Muslim traders transported more African slaves to Asia than by in the New World by Christians during the entire history of the Atlantic slave trade. Talking about Europeans, Muslims were involved with more slave trading. He says statistics for Islamic slavery are notoriously scarce and untrustworthy, but recent unpublished calculations suggest that the Islamic slave trade may have been almost twice as large as the better documented and more notorious slave trade to the Americas. Of course, the Islamic slave trade to the East began much earlier, some 8 centuries before the discovery of America. As early as 869 AD, tens of thousands of black slaves rose in mass insurrection in what is now southern Iraq, and for a dozen years carried out the most successful black revolt prior to the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s. The Islamic slave trade extended over 13 centuries and never approximated the intense volume of the Atlantic slave trade between 1701 and 1810, a period for which Philip D. Curtin's recent estimate of 6 million slave imports is now considered conservative. But in an estimate subject to more dispute, R.W. Beachy concludes that between the 1820s and 1870s, over 2 million slaves were exported from Africa to Asia. Curtin's estimate is somewhat lower for total New World slave imports. Now, again, you don't hear about Muslims trading blacks or engaged in slavery towards blacks. You don't really hear about that too often. Again, you always hear about it being a white thing. And it's just funny that you do have a lot of blacks, especially in America. Maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but you think of Islam. There are blacks that gravitate towards Islam, that become Muslims. And some blacks have this very pro-black ideology and mentality, and they become Muslims. And some of them become Muslims because they believe that the white man is the devil, so forth, and he's engaged in slavery of his people and this, and that. But it's like they forget, or they don't know about the fact that Muslims were also slave masters, and Muslims were also enslaving blacks. Right? You don't hear about that, especially in when you think about guys that go to jail. Sometimes they come out being Muslims because they get this new revelation. They undergo this this transformation, this enlightenment that the white man is this, and the white man, dominated the black man for years. But what about the fact that the Muslims were dominating the black man, and that the Muslims were engaged in slavery towards the black man? They're always pointing the finger on one side. Let me see. I think, that was the last point I wanted to make about that. But when I looked up that source that Thomas Sowell was talking about, there was a book called Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, written by Robert C. Davis. It says, it's the subtitle reads, White Slavery in the Mediterranean, the Barbary Coast in Italy. Again, how often do you hear about this? Christian slaves, Muslim masters. Now, what you hear is the reverse. Christian slave masters and Muslim slaves, or Christian slave masters and black slaves. You don't hear about white slavery in the Mediterranean, the Barbary Coast in Italy. You don't hear about that. So I just want to point these things out. And you know who wrote about this? A black man. Thomas Sowell was who wrote about this in his book. And so I wanted to go dig in a little bit and see where he got this information from. And this is one of the books that is mentioned in his book, Black Rednecks, White Liberals. But anyway, just some interesting points on slavery that I wanted to touch on today. I hope you guys found this interesting. I'll post some sources below in the description. But yes, again, history matters, truth matters. We have to really just understand that evil comes in all forms, shapes, sizes, all peoples, all races. It's not an exclusive thing, or it doesn't belong exclusively to a specific group of people. Everybody engages in evil. Okay? Even the scripture says, no one seeks after God. Right? When God flooded the earth, he flooded the whole earth. It wasn't just a specific region. It was the whole earth, because he saw that man was continuously wicked. And you think about the gospel is not directing. When the gospel speaks out against evil, it's speaking out against evil in all of mankind, not just one particular race, all of mankind, because everybody has fallen short from the glory of God, as the scripture says. When I say the scripture, I'm talking about the Bible. Anyway, I hope you guys found that interesting. Give me your feedback. Let me know what you think. I'll post some links. Check out Liberty Classroom. Support your boy. Check out the Instagram, all that good stuff. Anyway, enjoy your day. Peace. Search for truth. It's out there. On that note, I'm gone.